The moment Yusuf al-Rashidi stood up from that conference table and straightened his cufflinks, every person in that room knew the deal was dead. $400 million. Gone. Just like that. Nobody moved. The lawyers sat frozen behind their yellow legal pads. The real estate consultants stared at their laptops. And at the far end of the table, Hargrove Whitfield, the man who'd orchestrated this entire acquisition for 3 years, watched the most important deal of his career walk toward the door in a charcoal gray thobe and Italian leather shoes. But nobody noticed the old man in the maintenance uniform standing just outside the glass wall of the conference room, pushing a cleaning cart down the hallway. Nobody ever noticed him. His name was Otis Bernard Crenshaw, 67 years old. Gray at the temples, a small scar above his left eyebrow from a forklift accident in 1987, hands roughened from 4 decades of physical work. He'd been a maintenance worker at the Meridian Tower in downtown Chicago for 11 years. Before that, he was many other things that room full of lawyers and consultants would never think to ask about. That morning, he had been assigned to clean the executive floor. Standard rotation. He'd done it 1,000 times. He knew every corner of that building, which hallway vents whistled in February, which elevator doors needed an extra second before they fully opened, which conference rooms had poor acoustics, and which ones carried sound straight through the walls. Conference room A carried sound very well. He hadn't been eavesdropping. He'd simply been doing his job, moving slowly because his left knee had been acting up since Tuesday, when he heard the shift in the room. The laughter that had been coming through the glass wall 40 minutes earlier had gone silent. Then came the sound of a chair being pushed back hard. Then voices, clipped, terse, one of them in Arabic. Otis stopped his cart. He understood every word. Inside the conference room, Yusuf al-Rashidi was not simply walking out because negotiations had broken down. He was walking out because he had been insulted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, devastating way that only happens when someone assumes you don't understand what's being said about you. Hargrove had made that assumption. 20 minutes earlier, while Yusuf had stepped out to take a phone call, Hargrove had leaned toward his lead attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Sandra, and said, in English, casually, the way you speak when you believe no one important is listening, that the al-Rashidi Group's hesitation on the liability clause was typical Gulf overcaution, and that they just needed to let the Arabs feel like they won something small so we can close this before they change their minds again. Yusuf had returned to the room 2 minutes later. He hadn't said anything immediately. He'd sat back down, looked at the revised term sheet, and listened for another 15 minutes. Then he'd stood up, buttoned his jacket, and said, in perfect English, I think we are done here. Hargrove was still trying to understand what had happened. He was standing now, hands out, speaking quickly. Mr. al-Rashidi, if there's been some miscommunication about the terms. There has been no miscommunication, Yusuf said. I understood everything. Perfectly. He was almost to the door. Otis Bernard Crenshaw had a decision to make. He'd made decisions like this before, the kind that take less than 3 seconds but carry weight for years. In 1991, he'd made one in a courtroom in Beirut that saved the lives of 2 American journalists. In 2003, he'd made one in a conference room not unlike this one, in a language not unlike the one being spoken now. But that was a long time ago. That was a different life. A life that had ended. Not tragically, not dramatically, just quietly the way most lives change, with a divorce, a financial collapse, a series of mistakes that compounded until there was nothing left but starting over. Starting over at 56 had meant maintenance work, and maintenance work 11 years later had become his life. He left his cart in the hallway. He walked to the conference room door and knocked twice. A light, almost apologetic knock, and pushed it open before anyone could respond. Every head in the room turned. Hargrove's expression moved through confusion to irritation in about half a second. This room is occupied, he said. Otis didn't look at Hargrove. He looked at Yusuf al-Rashidi, who had paused with one hand on the doorframe, and he spoke in Arabic. Not the textbook kind, not the kind you learn in a semester abroad. The kind spoken in the old districts of Amman, with the particular cadence of someone who had lived there, eaten there, argued and laughed and negotiated there. He said, "Sir, I apologize for the interruption. I'm just a maintenance worker, and I have no business being in this room. But I heard something that you should know before you leave, and I would not be able to live with myself if I stayed quiet." The room was absolutely still. Yusuf slowly turned around. He looked at Otis, really looked at him, the way very few people in that building ever had. The gray uniform, the worn steel-toed boots, the cart visible through the glass behind him, and then the eyes, steady, unhurried, carrying something that didn't belong to the uniform. He answered in Arabic, "Say what you need to say." Hargrove made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a protest. "What is? Can someone tell me what's happening? Who authorized?" "Please," Otis said in English, glancing at Hargrove without hostility. "One moment." Then, back to Yusuf, in Arabic, the liability clause on page 31. The language was changed from the version initialed in the preliminary agreement. The original version gave your group the right to independent audit within 90 days. This version reduces that window to 30 and requires you to use an auditor from their approved list. The change is small enough to miss, but large enough to matter. Yusuf said nothing for a moment. He looked at Otis. Then he looked at Sandra, who had gone very still. Then he looked at Hargrove. Hargrove's face had changed. That's a standard revision. It's been disclosed in the page 31, Otis said quietly. Subsection 4, Clause B. The disclosure log dated this change at March 14th. The preliminary agreement was initialed on March 17th. The change came before the agreement, not after. So it was not disclosed, it was simply present. The room was silent for a very long time. Sandra was already pulling up the document on her laptop. Her expression, as she found the page, said everything. Yusuf turned back to Otis. He studied him for a long moment. Then he asked, in Arabic, "Who are you?" And Otis told him. Not the maintenance uniform version, the real version. His name was Otis Bernard Crenshaw. Before the maintenance cart, before Chicago, before the decade of rebuilding, he had spent 22 years as a commercial real estate attorney specializing in cross-border acquisitions in the Middle East and North Africa. He had negotiated deals in Amman, Riyadh, Dubai, and Casablanca. He had lived in Jordan for 6 years, long enough to speak the language, like a man who'd argued with taxi drivers and stayed up late in his neighbors' kitchens. He had been a partner at a firm in Washington, D.C. A good firm, a serious firm, until a series of events that he had no interest in rehashing dismantled that life piece by piece. He was not ashamed of the maintenance job. He said this plainly. It had given him stability when stability was the only thing he needed. It paid consistently. People left him alone. He'd made peace with it a long time ago. But he still knew what a fraudulent disclosure log looked like. And he still spoke Arabic. And some things, apparently, did not leave you, no matter what uniform you wore over them. Yusuf listened to all of this without interrupting. When Otis finished, Yusuf was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out a chair, not his chair, the one nearest to him, and set his briefcase down on the table. "I think," he said in English this time, so the whole room could hear, "I would like to sit back down." Hargrove said, "Mr. Al-Rashidi, I can assure you that the disclosure issue is simply a clerical Sandra." Yusuf said the name calmly, looking at his own attorney, not Hargrove's. "Pull every version of this agreement from the last 60 days. I want a comparison of every change made after March 10th, and I want it before we say another word about this deal." Sandra was already on it. Hargrove stood at the head of the table with his hands at his sides and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The old maintenance worker from the hallway had just done, in 2 minutes, what 3 years of legal back and forth had failed to catch. It took 47 minutes. Sandra, working alongside Yusuf's own counsel, a meticulous young man named Ferris, who had been quiet all morning and now was not, found 4 additional clause modifications that had been made between March 10th and March 17th, none of them properly disclosed, none of them catastrophic on their own. Together, they amounted to a systematic shifting of risk away from Hargrove's side and onto the al-Rashidi group, buried in the kind of technical language designed to be skimmed rather than read. It wasn't fraud, exactly. It was the kind of thing that happened all the time in deals this size, in rooms like this one, at the expense of the party that trusted the process. It happened because most people on the receiving end didn't have someone fluent enough to read between the lines. And it happened because the people doing it had long ago decided that nobody in the other room was paying close enough attention. They had not expected an old man in a maintenance uniform to be standing outside the door. At the end of the 47 minutes, Yusuf stood again. This time he did not button his jacket. He looked across the table at Hargrove and spoke with a particular kind of quietness. Not anger, not triumph, just clarity. We will renegotiate with the original clause language restored, or we will not renegotiate at all. You have until Friday. He picked up his briefcase. Then he walked over to Otis, who had been standing near the wall the entire time, a little uncertain about what to do with himself, wondering if he should step out, wondering if his cart was blocking the hallway, thinking about his left knee. Yusuf extended his hand. Otis shook it. You've done this before, Yusuf said, in Arabic, very quietly. A long time ago, Otis said. It doesn't seem to have left you. Otis thought about that for a moment. No, he said. I suppose it didn't. Yusuf nodded once. The lawyers, the consultants, the silent presence of Hargrove at the head of the table, and then he looked back at Otis. I'd like to have a conversation with you, not now, but soon, if you're willing. Otis looked at him steadily. I'm usually here Monday through Friday, he said. 7th floor. Something passed across Yusuf's face. Not pity, not condescension. Something closer to recognition. I'll find you, he said. He left the room. His team followed. Ferris, the young attorney, paused at the door and looked back at Otis with an expression that was hard to read. Something between admiration and something more complicated. The look of a young man recalibrating something he'd believed without examining it. Otis collected himself. He straightened his collar, a habit from the old life, then remembered where he was, who he was, and walked back out to his cart, in the hallway. He finished cleaning the 7th floor. He worked through lunch, his knee held up. Hargrove's firm sent revised documents on Thursday. All original clause language restored. 3 minor additions that Ferris had flagged as reasonable, which they were. The deal closed 6 weeks later, $412 million, with terms that held up under full independent audit, which Yusuf's team conducted immediately and thoroughly, as was now their right. Hargrove never spoke directly to Otis again. Some silences say more than any apology. Yusuf found him on the following Monday, as promised. Otis was replacing a fluorescent bulb in the corridor outside the 7th floor break room when the elevator opened and Yusuf stepped out, wearing a dark blue suit this time, alone without the team. He sat down on the small bench near the window, the one the maintenance staff used on breaks, and waited for Otis to finish. Otis finished. He stepped down from the step stool. He sat down on the other end of the bench and looked out at the Chicago skyline for a moment. I meant what I said, Yusuf told him. I'd like to talk seriously. I figured you did, Otis said. My group is opening an office here. We're going to need someone who knows how things work on the ground. Not just the law, the texture of it, the language of it, both literally and otherwise. Otis was quiet for a moment. Outside, a pigeon landed on the window ledge, considered its situation, and left. I'm 67 years old, Otis said. I know, I haven't practiced in 11 years. I'd have to look at my bar status. I know that too, and you'd trust someone you met in a hallway. Yusuf looked at him. I'd trust someone who walked into a room he had no business being in, because staying quiet would have cost him something. Yes, I would trust that person. Otis looked down at his hands. The calluses. The scar on his left knuckle from a sharp edge on a ventilation panel 3 winters ago. He thought about the bar association. He thought about what it would take. He thought about his apartment in Pilsen, the good light in the mornings, the coffee he made before the 5:45 train. He thought about the version of himself that had walked into that conference room on a bad knee without anyone asking him to. "Let me make some calls," he said. He was reinstated to the Illinois bar 4 months later. The process was not simple. There were continuing education requirements, a character review, paperwork that required other paperwork. But it moved forward steadily, the way things move when a person has earned the right to be serious about them. He gave his notice at Meridian Tower on a Thursday. His supervisor, a kind man named Jerome, shook his hand and said he'd always known Otis was something else, though he couldn't have said exactly what. His colleagues in the maintenance department, a group of people he had genuinely liked, whose company he would miss, threw him a small party in the break room on the 6th floor. There was sheet cake from the bakery on Michigan Avenue, and someone had printed a banner on the office printer that said, "Don't forget Yus, counselor," in slightly misaligned letters. Otis laughed at that banner for a long time. He folded it carefully and took it home. He started with the Al-Rashidi Group's Chicago office in February. His title was Senior Legal Counsel, Cross-Border Acquisitions. His office was on the 14th floor, with a window that looked west over the city. His first week, he wore a suit he'd bought in 2002 and had kept in a dry cleaning bag in the back of his closet for 11 years, waiting without knowing it was waiting. It still fit. Not perfectly. The shoulders were a little wide now, the way you change without noticing. But close enough. He had it tailored on a Saturday morning by a woman in Wicker Park who took one look at it and said, "This is good cloth." He agreed that it was. Some things last, and some things that look finished turn out to be only resting. I've thought about Otis a great deal since I first heard this story, about what it means to carry something with you for years. A skill, a language, a way of reading a room, and have it lie quiet under everything life piles on top of it. About what it takes to walk through a door you were never invited into, not because you planned to, not because you had anything to prove, but because the alternative was staying silent and you had already learned, somewhere along the way, that silence has a cost. Otis didn't walk into that conference room to reclaim his old life. He walked in because something was wrong, and he was the only one who knew it. That's a different kind of courage, quieter than the version we celebrate, less certain of its own outcome, and maybe more honest. Nobody in that room had ever looked at the old man with the cleaning cart and thought, "There is someone with 22 years of experience, someone who lived in Amman, someone who knows this language, someone who has read 1,000 contracts in 3 languages and knows exactly where the soft spots are hidden." They looked at the uniform and filled in the rest themselves. That's the thing about assumptions. They do your thinking for you, and they cost you. Sometimes more than you can afford. The deal closed. The office opened, and somewhere in Chicago, a man who spent 11 years replacing light bulbs is sitting in a 14th floor office, reading a contract in Arabic, catching the things that are meant not to be caught. Don't overlook the person in the hallway. You don't know what they're carrying.